Hello, everybody. I'm Todd Stoll. I'm the director in the Student Activities Office here at Schoolcraft College. On behalf of the International Institute and Student Activities, we'd like to welcome you today for the Expats, Millennials in China, Perceptions of Chinese Women, Men and Women. So Dr. John Brender will discuss perceptions of Chinese men and women through the eyes of millennial expats who have lived in China for an average of 4 to 6 years. Now, Dr. Brender is the Director of Special Initiatives for the Office of International Programs at Wayne State University, professionally dedicated to language and cultural education. Dr. Brender has taught English, Spanish, Japanese linguistics, foreign language teaching methodology, and English as a second language. He has also presented multiple lectures on cross-cultural communications in China and the US. His research focuses on international and ethnic student identity in North American universities and American experiences abroad. Dr. Brender holds a Ph.D. in higher adult and lifelong education from Michigan State University, an MA in Romance Linguistics from the University of Michigan, an MA in Community College Administration from Chicago State University, and a BA in Spanish from Hope College. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. John Brender.
Okay, just warning ahead of time, and I think a lot of you are familiar with my online lecture formats and even in person. I'm going to ask some people to read, so if you don't mind, maybe you can raise your hand electronically with those little yellow hands that they provide, and that'll keep me from having to scroll up and down, or I think you can just cough and that will bring you to the forefront. So as Professor Stoll mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about millennial expats in China and their perceptions of men and women. So without further ado, I have, as mentioned in a few previous lectures, I finished a manuscript for a book called Millennial Expats in China, and I'm looking at their personal experiences, but also their perceptions of Chinese institutions. So today we'll be talking very briefly or reviewing the participants in the study, and then we'll talk about their perceptions of Chinese men and of Chinese women. So the question that may come to mind is, Chinese men and women, really? Aren't there like 700 million of each of them? Isn't this kind of a minefield? Aren't you likely to come into stereotypes? Yes, I say, but this is about what millennial expats have to say. So I'm going to throw them under the bus. And so what you're about to hear today is not simply gospel about Chinese women are this way or Chinese men are that way or this way, but this is how the millennial expats who've lived in China for a while perceive them. And you might find that their opinions, their thoughts, their perceptions are reflective of their personal values. So the way somebody from another country might perceive Chinese men and women might be very different. So I think this is kind of a two-way study. It's looking at Chinese men and women, but I think we also need to look at the people who are providing their perceptions, who happen to be North American. Okay. So remember that the views expressed here are through the eyes of millennial expats in China, and not through the tired old eyes of an aging boomer / Gen Xer. Okay, so these are my eyes according to my wife, who drew this on her iPhone after I supposedly was quite jet lagged, although I think I can look like that most of the time. Let me give you a warning and a disclaimer, and this is a quote from one of my respondents who says, in China, there's so many people that everybody will be able to find examples to support their argument. So in some respects, I can say all Chinese people are X or all Chinese people are Y, and I will find plenty of people who will support whatever it happens to be. I will say, as I've said many, many times to many people, regarding China, when you've met one Chinese, you've met one Chinese, okay? Okay, just a quick review of the participant demographics of people I spoke with. I had 20 respondents, all millennials, so they ranged in age from 25 to 41. And you can see there's a fairly decent equal distribution, with most falling between the ages of 29 and 31, and also between 33 and 36. So This spans a generation. By race, of the 20, you'll notice that 12 were white, 5 were Black or African American, 2 Hispanics, 1 Asian American. By gender, there were about twice as many men as women, and though I cannot get official statistics, most of the people I talk with say that generally there are a lot more North American men than women in China for whatever reason. By major, by far, there were more humanities majors than science majors. The only science people we had studied environmental science or computer science. And many of the people who went to China, not surprisingly, were Asian studies majors, social science majors, and humanities majors. Also regarding participants in this study, in terms of years in China, you see the majority were there, or half were there between 4 and 6 years, with a fairly even distribution of people who were there 7 to 11 years or less than 2 years. Okay, most were, I think, at least 18 months. And in terms of a self-reported Chinese ability, a lot of them gave themselves a 3. I don't know how accurate this is. There are some people I thought rated themselves not quite as high as they should have. But a lot of that is the modesty that comes about living in Asia for a while. Also, I asked people to rate themselves on an introvert-extrovert scale, and I thought this was interesting. After having spoken with them, I felt I really had a pretty good span of people and personalities. So perhaps not surprisingly to me, at least, you'll see that there are people who rated themselves on at very different levels in terms of how outgoing they saw themselves as being. Okay, let's look at Chinese men first. And the overwhelming conclusions that I found via grounded theory, which basically means I'm looking at all the data and then trying to make sense of it, and in putting them together and grouping them, these are the categories that I found. 1, they were doted on by family as children, but shouldered huge expectations. They tended to be responsible and serious about family. They're quietly competitive, but less physically aggressive, slower to mature socially, but likely to make up for lost time. And there were also a variety of Chinese men, often looked at geographically. So let's talk about these perceptions. The first one is the little emperor syndrome, right? Doted on by family as children, but shouldering huge expectations. And when I say little emperor syndrome, and this is known by everyone across China, is that since the only child policy in 1979, where children grow up as only children, they've been to some extent spoiled and given the world, but on the other hand, given the economics of China, expected at some point to shoulder the responsibility of taking care of parents and possibly grandparents. So worst case scenario, if you want to call it that, is that you get married and suddenly you have 2 sets of parents who are going to retire soon and up to 4 sets of grandparents, and you may be responsible for keeping them going. So there is an awful lot of pressure that young people, especially young males, feel, and I should say women as well, because men and women tend to work outside the home while parents very often take care of the kids. So there's certainly a huge expectation for these people, especially as their children. They realize someday I'm going to have to take care of mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and so on. One of my respondents who had a Chinese boyfriend for 5 years, they were still dating, had this to say regarding Chinese men. So I'm looking for a first volunteer, and Professor Berg, since I see you're back and you're the first person in line, would you mind reading this for me? You're muted.
boyfriend does not know how to cook anything because his grandmother would cook him lunch every day. His mother would cook him dinner every night. I mean, there have been times that I've had to kind of look at him and be like, that's not how it works, right? I'll give you an example. There was a time when we were first dating and he was over at my apartment. I was cleaning. I told him, I'm going to be cleaning today, but you're welcome to come and keep me company. And I'm cleaning the floors and he goes, why are you doing that? And I was like, because you need to clean your floors. Well, nobody cleans the floors in my house. And I'm like, I've literally seen your mom mopping the floor at your house.
Okay. So this may speak for a certain group of especially Chinese men who sometimes are not expected to pull their weight in terms of cooking and cleaning. But on the other hand, there was another woman in this very group who had married a Chinese man from Gansu province, and they were living in Wuhan. And she had something very different to say. So any show of hands to read? I'll just randomly call on someone. Jennifer Bolt, would you mind reading?
Yeah, I can read.
Mhm.
All right. So my husband, he does a lot of great things. Like, I don't know if I would find that in the States, with a guy. Like, he helps me. There's a lot of chores that he likes to do. I used to think it would be a woman's job, but I don't know why I think like that. But I'm like, oh, this is for me. I'm supposed to do this. But then he likes to do it. It's fine. I mean, it's normal. He should do it too. And I could do his work too, his chores. And there's no complaint about that. And I think it depends on couples who you choose to be with.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. So this was actually a woman from a Hmong family, an immigrant family, and her take on Chinese women or Chinese men was, at least in her experience, they tended to be a bit more helpful than tended to be the stereotype with a lot of other folks. All right, another thing that came up repeatedly in my interviews was that Chinese men were responsible and serious about family. So this came from a woman who had spent some time in Shanghai. And if I can get, let me see, Caitlin, are you there to read this?
Yep. Chinese men, I think a lot of them, probably because the expectations on them are different, but it seems like they're very set in a traditional kind of mindset. Like, okay, I get this job, I get married. Once I get married, I have these kids. Yes. And we have our little place, and that's that. And as I said, it probably has a lot to do with the expectations put on them, especially on the man in China or whatnot.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of, as I mentioned, stemming from the little emperor syndrome, there's a lot of tendency for men to feel this pressure and to follow a rather set path, or a path that is expected of them, that they will become bread earners or rice earners, if you will, and really take care of a family. I don't know that that's the same in the U.S. I think there's a bit more freedom, sometimes an encouragement to go out and do things post college and so on, get to know who you are and know thyself. Here's another thing that came from the same graduate student who felt that, there was a pressure not just to follow a certain path, but basically to marry someone from within your own culture, that the dating from outside was taboo. It just did not fit within the expectations. So let me see if I can ask Brooke Forster. Are you there?
Yeah, I can read.
Mhm.
I think a lot of Chinese men don't even look at foreigners really as a possibility in the dating pool, I guess friends, yes, because you can use it as a utility. You can improve your English and so on and so forth. But in terms of dating or marrying a foreigner, it's like you're going against a lot of big pressure, cultural norms that I think a lot of Chinese men just don't. They don't mess with it,
Okay, thank you. as we'll see later on, there tends to be a lot of acceptance for Chinese women to date foreign men, but less so. You may have noticed just in general that you don't see a lot of Chinese men with Western women, but you do tend to see a lot more of the reverse. I don't have statistics on this, but it's a general observation. But that being said, 2 of the 5 women in this survey were engaged or married to Chinese men. So it certainly does happen. Marriage oriented. This was a quote that came to me from a young man from the Bahamas who was sort of surprised at Chinese men and their propensity to think so much about marriage at a young age. I don't know about a lot of you, but wow, I wasn't thinking about marriage until I was 30. So can I ask, is Nolan there? Would you mind reading?
You want to have a family, you have to get married, but it seems to be the topic of conversation of every young Chinese person. Like, it just doesn't seem to come up that much in my conversations with other people. And that's both the males and females in Chinese society. Like, the men are also marriage obsessed, like talking about it.
Okay, thank you. I don't know what your personal experiences are, but I don't see this quite being the topic with a lot of young men in the US, but obviously there's a lot of pressure that I've seen personally that Chinese men and women are put under by especially their parents. You need to get married, you need to start thinking about this. Are you dating anyone? So on and so forth. Next, responsible. What is game? Does anybody recognize the character on the right? That's Tim Meadows, who played the ladies' man on Saturday Night Live, I think during the 90s. Let me see if I can get someone here. Megan, would you mind reading?
Sure. Because their role is, we need to be providers, and women do not want men who are not providers. So they're more oriented to that. They perceive that they will be more of a catch if a girl looks at them as a strong worker.
Okay. So when we talk about what is game, what will attract women, a lot of Western men are, more fixated on, how smooth they can talk or how good looking they are or what their athletic prowess is and so on and so forth. But a lot of the Chinese men realize, okay, we need to be very practical. And if we look like we're going to be good prospects and good providers, that's what women want. And take it from Napoleon Dynamite, girls like guys with skills, okay? I think to a lot of Americans, this was a laughable phrase because Americans don't often think in those terms. But in China, it's somewhat serious. All right, quietly competitive. I thought this was kind of interesting. I had some quotes from a number of people on this. So one of the students that I have who is currently living in Taiwan said, I guess we have more machismo in the West, and in Asia, it's very fluid. There's more than one way to be a man. The biggest thing that you just have to do is take care of your family and make money and get a car and get a wife. That is just the biggest thing in China. Okay. I had some additional quotes. So if I can ask Hannah, can you read this for me, please? And this is the same person. Hannah, how about Sherry? Are you available?
Sherry doesn't have a microphone.
Oh,
I'll
okay.
read for you.
Okay, let's go. Yeah, if you would.
Masculinity redefined. I feel like, especially compared to Black culture, it's a lot more open because, you get your K-pop boys, you get your nerd guys, you get your jocks, you have all the range. And I think it's more acceptable to be who you are in China than in America, at least from my experience.
Okay. And obviously, a lot of people come from cultures where there's certain expectations that are put upon us in the West in terms of what it means to be a man. Don't cry or show your physical strength or your ability this way and that way. And some of the observations are that, men can be a bit more effeminate, and that's perfectly acceptable within Chinese society, and in certain subgroups in America, perhaps less so. Another masculinity redefined is, I had a student who said, they're not being boisterous, not yelling on the freeway, on the subway. They're not wearing crazy clothes to stand out. They're not too worried about that. They're much more concerned typically with standing out in a societal way. Like, how can my family brag about me? How can I lord it over my cousin in some weird way, right? So it's not necessarily about being the football hero, about being the great athlete or things of that sort, but it's like, how do I succeed financially or in terms of society, and how can I be heralded that way without running out and screaming, "Look who I am." Confidence. This was from a woman who married a Chinese man. Let me see. Sarah, are you available to read?
Yeah, I think men in the States, they're also more confident. I would say that. I never thought that I would marry a Chinese guy here because I used to think like they lack a lot of confidence. They couldn't even look at me in the eyes when they were talking to me, even though we're just friends too. It was really strange for me.
Yeah, thank you. So what we'll see is that Chinese men through college, at least through the perceptions of our expat millennials, tended to be on the shy side, but that as you'll see in a little bit, they made up for lost time as they matured. This may have a lot to do with the fact that a lot of Chinese are so dedicated to study in high school that they tend to perhaps mature socially a bit later. So their nose is so close to the grindstone that it takes a little while for them to really blossom, because they really don't have time to be with a lot of other people. I thought this was interesting. This was from a young lady who was teaching at a university in Wuhan. I'm going to call this Of Turtles and Dogs. So let me see, who is not spoken. Is Alante available?
Yep. A young, attractive teacher or viewably attractive teacher in front of young Chinese men gets an experience like total shutdown from her male students, right? Like no communication, barely any eye contact. Like they hardly want to answer a question. They're so closed off in a shell versus if you have a young generation of men with like a viewably attractive teacher in front of them in the US. They're going to be like dogs, Like, oh my God, she's so cute. So only a few years older than I am. I could totally score that. You have this difference of like way too respectful to being no respect at all.
Okay, thank you, Alante. So this was her perception as a young teacher in China. This is from a young man in the Bahamas who also had a few things to say about masculinity being redefined. Alante, would you mind reading one more?
Yeah. A lot of the guys that I know in the Bahamas tend to be very excitable. What they think is masculine is like riding on the back of a motorcycle, like doing dangerous stuff, playing with their life, basically playing with death. That's exciting to them. And you don't see that type of thing in China. I wouldn't say it's like a bad thing, actually. You probably have a lot of depth on your hand. You probably have a lot of depth on your hand if they had everyone taking chances like they do in the Bahamas. So kudos.
Okay. So the masculine behavior is not necessarily being, wild and so on and so forth in China. As I mentioned, most of my respondents seem to say, well, the competition for a lot of Chinese men was more in terms of academic and financial, personal and career success rather than anything that might be showy or athletic or things of that sort. So we were kind of getting at this idea of Chinese men being slower to mature socially, but likely to make it up for a lost time. So this came from the same woman who was talking about the total shutdown of men in class. So if I can ask, let me see who we haven't, Anita, could you read?
Yes, sure. The biggest difference between Chinese men and American men are it flip-flops. American men are dogs in their youth and become more respectful, and then Chinese men are very, very hyper shy when they're young and almost like I am God's gift to earth when they're older.
Okay. So this is, I'm not endorsing this one way or another, but I thought it was an interesting observation. I can tell you that, for example, alcohol consumption, which can be pretty extreme at a lot of American universities, probably dissipates a little bit afterward. Whereas in China, I would say that there's far less of a party scene. Not many students drink, not many can really afford to. But once you get into the business world, there tends to be a lot more fraternal type camaraderie, so to speak. So we're looking at the cultural flip-flop. We see the young Americans in college and fraternity and spring break that everybody's missing. Well, apparently not, down in Florida. And in China, it begins probably in your late 20s or early 30s when you're going out with business contacts and you're drinking and basically showing that I will do anything for you. I will be, have a huge hangover for you because you mean so much to me. And then they'll just drink and prodigious amounts, trust me. Next, I'll read this. This came from another student who said, it would be an hour. This is a respondent who lived in China for 5 or 6 years, was married to a Chinese national, and while teaching also had done a little bit of business in China as well, but entrepreneurial. So he says, it would be an hour and a half long dinner just talking. And then it would be like 10 minutes or 15 minutes or even an hour of business. And then the whole time getting wildly drunk off of baijiu, so that when you get to the business, everybody's well hammered and ready to discuss. So the drinking in China is not just simply sipping wine and discussing the novels of Hemingway. It's drinking games and rolling dice to see how much you drink, or asking questions and that type of thing. And finally, we have some people noted varieties of Chinese men across regions. As I said, you've met one Chinese, but you can also see that people mention that there's a particular fluidity of Chinese men. You have, your rough and tumble construction workers, your refined businessmen in Shanghai, the K-pop boys, the farmers, and so on. I mean, it's very difficult to say all Chinese men are A and B, but we certainly can come to the conclusion that Chinese men are different on many levels. So this came from a woman, I believe, in Shanghai, and who hasn't read yet? If anybody wants to, Siobhan, would you mind reading?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, if women want to stay independent or whatever, then they look for a Shanghainese man, because Shanghainese men kind of act as the woman in the relationship and carries her bags and purses, cooks the dinner, helps raise the kids, and let her do whatever she wants and whatnot. And if you want a strong kind of stereotypical man or whatever, then you go for the northern men, like in Beijing, because they don't take no crap and they're really strong-willed and whatnot, and will probably fight you on the drop of a hat.
Okay. So, I mean, we can call this a stereotype, but I've heard this again and again, that the northern men tend to be, the burly, strong, more traditionally masculine types, and men in Shanghai have a tendency, especially, to be much more refined and submissive in many respects. So let's talk about Chinese women for a bit. And so the prevailing comments that came after using grounded theory and analyzing what people had said is that Chinese women tended to be cute and girly, naive and innocent, reserved and submissive, interested in financial security, sometimes dramatic. varied tremendously. We'll talk a little bit about their attitudes toward foreign men and the changes that occurred as they matured. So Mao Zedong was famous for saying, women hold up half the sky, right? So this was sort of his original exhortation to advocate the quality of women, that, you know, women's skills could, as you can see, there's a woman with a wrench and another woman with a mallet. So they're obviously partaking of strong endeavors that are traditionally associated with men. So Mao, at least in terms of his lip service, certainly advocated toward equality between men and women in terms of role play, or in terms of their roles and so on. So this one was had to do with something called Sadjiao. And let me ask Dante if you would not mind reading this.
Yeah, I can read. The women, the culture there, especially in China, is to be more cute. And so the girls do the kind of Sadjiao, which is acting spoiled, like I hate you in Wuhan more. Not as much, was it
In
Hefei?
Hefei, yeah.
Hefei. They didn't really do that as much in Hefei.
Okay, so there's this idea of in China called Sadjiao, and it's to sort of act, you know, cute, like, oh, I hate you, you know, very. You might occasionally run across someone like that, although it's not a very American thing. If anybody has seen Breakfast at Tiffany's, I think Audrey Hepburn sort of typifies the whole idea of Sadjiao. She can sort of be fickle and cute and girly and all of these things at once. Sadjiao is everywhere. So Chinese professor I quoted as saying, Sadjiao is human nature. It exists in everybody because inside everybody's heart, there is a child. And a friend of mine from Colombia sent me this kind of random video of a woman called Lady Vanessa. And she really typified the whole Sadjiao. I mean, she's in her 20s and was just, you know, very acting cute and girly and so on and so forth. So this concept is certainly not unique to China. I would argue that it's probably a lot less common, less acceptable in North American circles, but it's certainly not by any means exclusive to China. This came from one of my former assistants who talked about, when I asked her about Sadjiao, she had this to say. Is it Nia? George, can I ask you to speak? To read? May Wagner, are you available?
Vulnerability or making oneself look like a child, usually used when they ask for something. In my culture, women who are innocent and childlike are more popular with men, and such women also seem to be born to be petulant. From my personal experience, this works for all heterosexual Chinese men. I had trouble trying to Sadjiao with Americans, but found out they don't buy it. My American boyfriend said he felt disgusted when women Sadjiao. However, American men still have weaknesses. For example, they favor women with a sense of humor, especially when you laugh at his jokes. So sometimes I use this technique instead of Sadjiao.
Okay, thank you. I thought this was kind of an interesting admission, especially when this person said, well, this is what we do and it works. But obviously she found that she ran up against some difficulties with American men, that they didn't necessarily appreciate the whining or the extreme cuteness. And I think someone pointed out that some of these pictures that I found on the internet were included a lot of Koreans, but Sadjiao is definitely a strong part of Korean as well as Japanese culture. I will personally attest. Cute versus sultry. Let me see. Can I ask? Hasn't read. Ellis, would you mind reading? And this is from an American student who had studied a lot about gender role differences in China.
I think that the typical American woman starts wanting to grow up very quickly, and there's a difference between being cute and being sexy. And I think a lot of American women tend to go for the more mature, sort of sexy, ideal person. But in China, they tend to stay very cute a long time. You want to be cute, even if you're a 35-year-old woman, you're going to wear ruffles and pink skirts.
Okay. So that observation is, and this is again through the eyes of an American, and what we expect, and you know, through decades of feminism, and to see Chinese women, she felt, wow, there's just this propensity to want to be cute and to be cute for a long time. And she continued with Ellis, if you wouldn't mind reading this.
Sure. You didn't see ads that were sultry. I at least didn't see many movies that were like that. They portrayed women in movies that were either very innocent, or if they were sultry, they were probably the bad guys' laughs. It's very cute.
Okay. So this is, again, the perception of Chinese women through American eyes. This came from an African-American graduate student in Shanghai. So if somebody would not mind reading this, isn't read, Megan?
Overall, Chinese women seem, well, I don't want to say they seem more innocent, you know, like they can get attached to you a lot faster. They don't have that suspicion. I feel like a lot of American women, they have that suspicion when encountering a man. It's like, okay, what are you after? Like, what are you going to ask me? Whatever, not Chinese women. Nope. They just come up with like, yay, we're friends. Yay. You want to kiss me? Okay. Yay, we're going out. Yay, we'll probably get married one day. It's like, oh, bless your hearts. Please run away from the man that has entrapped you. That's just a lot of the things I want to say.
Okay. So again, there's a bit of innocence and sort of a delayed maturity, probably because, as I mentioned, high school students tend to dedicate themselves very deeply to studies. And so that social aspect of things tends to be a bit delayed. And so by an American woman's standards in her early 20s, she generally is likely to find Chinese women a bit more innocent and maybe naive. Now, high school dating is verboten. It is not something that people look kindly on. People can get suspended for dating. It's discouraged by parents and probably even more by schools. So this is something that a woman from California mentioned to me. So if I can ask someone to read, Kevin Taylor.
Sure. Chinese women tend to be much more shy in public. They don't like to be seen as loud, or they don't like to be seen as too opinionated. And I think that's all very culturally based, you know, the idea that men are preferred and women are kind of secondary class, which is unfortunate because I know a lot of really amazing Chinese women who could kick butt in America, but they're too shy to be confident in themselves.
Okay. So yeah, there certainly, I had more than a few people mention the fact that the Chinese women often, you know, held back, especially in social situations, that they didn't want to be out there or, you know, the center of attention and so on, that they would often feel a certain pressure to be reserved. Now, this is going to be an offensive joke to most Americans, but in China, this is something that is well known, that everybody knows this quote unquote joke, and that is that there are three sexes in China. There are men, there are women, and there are women with PhDs. So the quote unquote joke here is that women who are considered too smart, too intellectual, are too intimidating to get married, that men will stay away from them. Now, I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, I spent a lot of time on college campuses in China. I know a lot of female professors, and the vast majority of them are married, very often to men who have PhDs. But the idea or the perception is that a woman who is too smart, too brainy, might just be taking herself out of the marriage pool. So here's some quotes regarding this. So there's another very sexist term in China called leftover women. And these are the women who are not going to get married. And oftentimes they look toward those who are overly educated. So if you would, Claire, would you mind reading this? Can you unmute?
Unmute myself.
Yeah.
There's that joke about there being married girls and there being doctorates. You know, like if you go for a doctorate, you're not going to find a husband. You're going to be one of the leftovers. I mean, that's a palpable thing over there. You hear people talk about it all the time. And I feel like it's kind of strange to hear girls in college over there. If you ask them, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? That kind of thing. A lot of them will answer housewife. And, you know, not give a second thought about it, which is strange because over here, if you see someone majoring in getting a master's in chemistry and you ask what they want to do, you're going to hear about their career ambitions usually or what they hope to do after they graduate. And it's not going to be housewife. We kind of might look down on that in a lot of ways. Oh, you know, you're not independent. You just want the white picket fence. Whereas over there, it's totally normal. People don't think twice about it.
Yeah, thank you. I should mention that when I showed this particular chapter to a friend in China, she objected to this more than anything else. It may be because she was a professor at a very high-ranking university. So as you can imagine, a woman who goes to Harvard would be far less likely to compromise principles and in terms of career ambition. But on the other hand, I've had other people support this particular statement and say there are women maybe at mid-level universities who might be willing to give things up in order to get married and live whatever life. So the jury's still out on this one, but let's go on to the next. Now, there's also this sense, especially among my respondents, that women were interested in financial security. And there's this well-known concept in China that in order to get married, men must have 3 keys. And that includes the keys to an apartment or to a paid-for flat. It's paid in full, the keys to an office, and the keys to a car. And so these are the things that men often aspire to, and supposedly women look toward when they get married. So you need to buckle down and by a certain age, have those 3 keys. Now contrast that with the 1950s through the 1970s, the 4 big things that the government wanted to see people own were a wristwatch, a sewing machine, a radio, and a bicycle. Okay, so China's certainly come a long ways in terms of economic expectations over the years. There's an internet sensation where a woman was quoted, I believe, on a game show for saying, "I'd rather cry in a Rolls Royce than laugh on a bicycle." Okay, so this came from a respondent to a woman who was on some kind of Chinese dating show, who, when asked by an unemployed man, "Would you marry me in spite of being unemployed?" she said, "No, I'd much rather cry in a Rolls Royce or in a BMW than laugh on the back of a bicycle." Okay, so a lot of controversy was sparked. A lot of people, the netizens, so to speak, sounded off on this. Is China becoming too materialistic, and so on? Okay, for love or money, and this is something that a quote that came from a man who's about 30 and engaged to a Chinese woman at present. And let me ask Professor Berg, would you mind reading? You're muted. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted, Professor Berg. Still muted. You're muted.
I didn't unmute myself.
Okay, now you are. Okay, there you go.
I'm sorry about that.
Let me go back. Okay.
I guess the one glaring difference is that, yes, Chinese women are in general much more concerned with economic status, but that purely relates to long-term marriages, relationship stuff. In the US, I'm sorry, they just went crazy. I think you'll find that, but I would say that you'd find a dramatically higher number of women in the US that are willing to marry for love rather than for lifestyle change.
Okay. So for love or money, I think that's probably an embarrassing question for a lot of American women and maybe even men. Why are we getting married? But I think the perception, at least among North Americans in China, is that Chinese women can be very practical. You can dispute that, and I'm not claiming that it is the truth, but it is what my respondents had come to say. Next, this same gentleman continued to talk about what was going on in terms of the opinions of women on the internet. So I'm going to ask Professor Berg to continue reading this and unmute.
There is an actually alarming number of dirty white supremacist white dudes that live in China, and they talk smack about the culture and make all kinds of really crass stereotypic remarks about the people that they're living around. And it's just crazy. But anyway, some of these people would probably tell you that lots of Chinese girl or lots of Chinese women want to marry a foreign husband for status reasons or something. That's like preferred, and you get an easy bonus.
Okay, thank you. So you will definitely hear Chinese as well as Americans sort of complain about this, that, there's a certain amount of dating between Western men and Chinese women, and that, somehow there's some sort of status or there's some money or that Americans are rich and that kind of a thing. So related to the concept that we talked about, Sadjiao, is that Chinese women can sometimes be dramatic. And so one of the students that I spoke with who was in Shanghai had this to say. She said, so a lot of my experiences observing Chinese couples is rooted in Shanghai. And let me tell you, I have not seen so many kind of openly abusive Chinese women. I just felt kind of bad. Like, it was just every day I seemed to look out the window on the bus and there was a Chinese woman yelling at her boyfriend who's sitting there looking really sad while holding her purse. Hold on, oops. And she storms off and he just scurries after her like a kicked puppy. That was interesting. Okay, so if you are in China for a while, and this is not saying that it's any large percentage, but you will often see a lover's quarrel on the street. Not every day, but if you're there for a little while, you'll start to see, for example, a woman run to a park bench and fold her arms, and the man will eventually come scurrying after her and try to appease her. And but it's relatively commonplace. I mean, given the thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that you will pass on the street, it's not like it's a huge percentage, but it does seem to be a feature of Chinese life to some extent. Next, there was tremendous variation in terms of character. So anything that I'm telling you can easily be refuted by other examples. And as our one student said in the beginning, there's so many people that everybody will be able to find examples to support their argument. Okay, so X can equal an orange triangle, it can equal a yellow circle, it can equal a lot of things. So when you're studying the Chinese and you have 1.4 billion subjects, you should probably be a little bit careful. Varying attitudes of Chinese women. So if I can ask Ms. Todd Stoll to read.
Sure. Okay, so varying attitudes of Chinese women towards foreign men. Everything's slower socially, except initial meetings. I mean, initial meetings are fast. I mean, it's really easy because people like women just come up and would talk to me, and not like I'm talking about my own experience dating. like women would just come talk to me in ways that would not happen in the US. And that could be just because I was foreign. I'm sure that's a huge part of it. But I noticed that with Chinese people too, it was women that seemed to initiate a lot of interactions, whereas I feel like in America, there's a lot more expected that the man would initiate.
Okay, thank you. So as a lot of you know, I was a director of the Confucius Institute at Wayne State for 13 years, and I had quite a number of female graduate assistants who were majoring in things like teaching Chinese as a foreign language. And interestingly, I think we had 6 or 7 marriages just of women who had often met Chinese men at the College of Engineering or the physics department and so on. And I don't know exactly how often, who initiated or what, but I thought that it was kind of interesting odds that we had so many marriages inside of the time that I was there. Next, women, as they grew older and more mature, they tended to become a lot less of all the things that we discussed. They tended to become a bit more dominant, especially as the matriarch of the circles. And I have to say that in terms of retirement, Chinese really know how to do it well. Men generally retire at 60 and women at 55 if they're working. And there's a lot of just outdoor activities, dancing in the park, doing Tai Chi, playing chess. There's really a lot of community that you don't often see here in the US. And there's just some pictures that were shared from a friend of mine in China about the concept of the Dhamma, which is literally translated as Big Mother. And they're really enjoying their older years, and they're characterized by carrying around these colorful scarves, and they have an ever-present husband taking pictures of them, making cute poses, running through flowers and all that sort of thing. It's just kind of an interesting thing to observe. But I would say, for the most part, retirement in China, I think, tends to be a really good part of many people's lives. So just to quickly recap, for Chinese men, in terms of observations posed by millennial expats in China, the Chinese men tended to be doted on by families' children, but shouldering huge expectations. They were responsible and serious about family to an extraordinary degree, quietly competitive, but reserved and less physically aggressive than their Western counterparts. They were slower to mature socially, but likely to make up for lost time. There were varieties of Chinese men, especially across regions. As for Chinese women, especially younger Chinese women, they were noted for being cute and girly, naive and innocent, reserved and submissive, interested in financial security, sometimes dramatic. They varied tremendously in personality and character. The generalization should be regarded with extreme caution. There were varying attitudes of Chinese women toward foreign men, but they're far more receptive toward foreign men than were Chinese men toward foreign women. And that there were changes that they had observed in women as they grew older and more mature. So that concludes what I have to say, but I do know that Professor Berg will ask me, why does this matter? So I'm going to try to preemptively answer that. What we're seeing here is values, and values, as I've tried to make understood in past presentations, I think are extremely important for everyone to understand. It's important to understand, that we have values. We may not have thought a lot about, what are our values, but it's important to note that people from other cultures have different values, and we need to ask ourselves, what are these values and why are they different? And to ourselves, are these good differences, bad differences? Now, there are really not a lot of values that I think are all good one way or all bad another way. But I think as individuals, as human beings, it's really important for us to look at another culture, to contrast some of the values that you see there, to become aware, to become cognizant of your own values, and then maybe to make some decisions about yourself in terms of, well, maybe some of these values are things that I should adopt, things that really have been overlooked by my own culture, and I really appreciate this. And the other thing is to be able to accept other people and other people's values, and realizing these are not necessarily bad values. These are just different values, and I need to be able to look at them from another person's perspective. So I think this is all part of the maturation process. I think it's a part of becoming a global citizen. It's a part of becoming, I think, a more heightened individual, better understanding yourself, better understanding the world, better understanding the various types of people that we are going to work with and hopefully become friends with. So with that, I will be happy to open the floor for questions. I have not kept my eye on time at all.
We're just
So
coming up on 2 o'clock.
Are there questions?
So yeah, we do have some time for some questions here at the end. If anybody wants to put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you could do that as well. Steve's got to go. He says he's got another class. So,
okay.
Of course, we want to thank John for coming on today and speaking to this topic. I think it was a fascinating topic, and just to see what our differences and some of our similarities really. So I really appreciate your time to do that. Let's see if we have any other questions in here as well. It seems like they've gotten the message and gotten all of the information. I don't have any questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay.
So I guess we will let people get on with their day. It's an almost 80-degree day outside, so I think that might be part of it.
Oh my goodness! Wow. I have to run out then.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you everybody for attending. We appreciate you. I'm going to put in the chat the sign up Genius link as well. So if you're interested in participating, with that, you can actually sign up on our Sign Up Genius, and that will also give you a chance to win some prizes at the end of the semester here, including an Apple Watch, AirPods, and some Amazon gift cards. So so please sign up there, but it'll also tell us who all attended today, so we can provide that to your instructors. So after that, John, thank you very much again. We appreciate your time, and we will sign off here on the